Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hope you're all safe, sound, and healthy. And we are going to talk about some facts. Okay, these are facts that obviously I've harped about, you can say, every now and then in general, about the corruption level of Pakistan, about the fact that it's in our blood, that every single person in this country has become so corrupt that they have forgotten to even distinguish between haram and halal, literally, practically, seriously. Okay. But now let us try to go into the government, the elite culture, the elite capture, we can say, the IMF and its role and everything in, you know, making it possible for elite capture to even occur. We're going to talk about how corruption has basically put us where we are today. Okay? Now, the current caretaker and PDM led government, which is essentially the same people came as caretaker and then the same people took over as Form 47, which is illegal, stolen mandate. The PDM led governments. Between 2023 and 2024, they set records by borrowing nearly 4 trillion rupees from banks, primarily to service existing high interest debt and manage fiscal deficits exceeding 28% inflation. This massive borrowing pressures the economy, okay? It crowds out private sector credit and it fuels inflation. These are the consequences. Now, this approach, if we compare it with the approach of Imran Khan's approach was to avoid the IMF, tough conditions, basically he wanted to tough out everything. And initially, he wanted to avoid the IMF's own tough conditions as well by relying on friendly loans, eventually resulting in the 22nd IMF bailout due to worsening conditions, right? Now, we will look at the repercussions of the loans taken by this government between 2023 and 2024 and see how much it has affected us. First of all, as we said, it has borrowed nearly 4 trillion rupees from domestic banks, exceeding the total borrowing of the entire previous fiscal year. Okay? This extensively was supposedly to cover the high interest payments, which was around 21% returns to banks and escalating expenses, resulting in over 50% of the budget being consumed by debt servicing. Then, heavy bank borrowing leaves limited credit for private sector, which contributes to a decline in economic activities. Then we have the increased inflation factor, because high borrowing increases money supply, intensifying inflationary pressures, which have exceeded 28%. Now, the persistent reliance on borrowing instead of revenue growth leaves the country reliant on future IMF bailouts, such as the $7 billion deal. Now, let's compare it with Imran Khan's loan policies between 2018 to 2022. His initial strategy was basically to avoid the stringent IMF conditions by securing friendly loans from China, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. But due to the worsening economic conditions, the PTI government entered the 22nd IMF program for $1 billion US dollars loan in 2019, accepting conditions like removing energy subsidies and increasing taxation. But mind you, they actually did not remove so much of the energy subsidies. They may have worked around it, but we as solar producers, we know that the government actually stuck by its deal with us till the end of doing a unit to unit sell and buy, where we were selling the government from our solar energy, and we were in return buying from or getting from the government the exact equivalent of unit to unit of the grid or main energy supply. Okay? Now, according to the critics, they were like, oh, the debts and the liabilities increased by over 80% during PTI tenure, leading to 31 billion in net external debt despite pledges to curtail debt. But the truth is that the PTI loans were often aimed at preventing default, whereas the current government is heavily utilizing domestic bank debt for day-to-day operations and interest payments. So both governments faced debt crisis, but the current government faces a higher interest rate environment compared to the PTI era. Okay? Now, the ongoing, if you look at this ongoing dependency with the IMF that was actually forced into by the US, by the way. So if you now look at these on the record statements, and then you go behind the scenes, and you know that the Americans literally have always pressured Pakistan to be dependent on IMF. Because there are two things that are going on. One, because of this, Pakistan can never maintain or regain its independence, which is its financial independence leading to its political independence, which is crucial to American national interest and British national interest, that Pakistan should never retain that independence. Okay? And then on the second front, through the IMF, basically America tends to pay off its mercenaries in the bureaucratic machinery and in official, the army, the media, the government, as it stands today, the Form 47 government, for example. So they basically give them payment through the facade of the IMF for completing their mercenary projects, right? Because the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in its November 2025 Governance and Corruption Diagnostic Assessment, which is the GCDA, identified this elite privilege as the primary driver of Pakistan's chronic instability, food insecurity, and financial scarcity, as elite groups protect their interests by siphoning public resources. Now, here I would blame the IMF, because the IMF itself is the architect. You see, the IMF, when it loans you money, it just doesn't loan you money, then it designs the way it needs to get that money back. And the IMF thinks that it is being very futuristic, very foresighted when it decides to penalize the public, when it decides to burden the public with the debt return, right? So give money to the governments, give loans to the elites, and then design a whole system through which you can get the money from the mass, the public, who, by the way, the IMF are 100% aware of the fact that the money is not even being used on, right? Not a penny of any of these loans that which on the record are saying that they are in order to serve, take care of other debts and this and that. No, not a penny of these loans are being put back to where they should be. Again, as opposed to Imran Khan's time, where actually every single money was held accountable and every single penny was accounted for. And our GDP had increased and we actually had money in the treasury. Whereas the first thing that as I keep on reminding you, the first thing that this government did was to empty the treasury, close down all the shelters, close down all the welfare projects, close down even government schools. Yes, this too has been done by Maryam Nawaz, closing down of government schools, and then trying to sell these government schools to private sectors, to private groups. Similarly, shutting down of the PIA, selling it to a private sector, which is actually ultimately selling it to the army, so basically selling it to themselves, in other words, and then again throwing the debt on the public. So you've sold the assets of PIA, you've sold the whole company of PIA, but you did not sell the debt along with it. No, the debt was left for, again, the people to bear. Why? When the people are not even going to use it. Similarly, imposing of miscellaneous taxes, illegal taxes, and levies where they're not even supposed to be, where even in Islam they're basically haram, because you cannot impose certain kinds of taxes and levies on your mass, on the public, according to Islamic law. But here we are. So now we're sitting at this point where we have the IMF itself being 100% responsible for putting all the burden of those loans issued to the government, which aren't even loans, but they're basically finances given to the government so that it can complete the mission of the task, whatever it is that it has been planted here to do. And in that, obviously, it involves giving of bribes, giving of assets, giving of lands, giving of properties to people within the bureaucratic machinery and within the army, right? So that they can stay loyal to these traitors and work against Pakistan's interests. And then the IMF actually has the gall to identify the elite capture of the country. If the IMF can dictate the way money can be taken from the masses to repay back the loans, then I'm sure they could have dictated a way to siphon off the money from the individuals or the political parties that they are giving the loans to, identifying their personal assets, identifying the fact that the money is going into their personal accounts, identifying that the money is being used for personal indulgence, such as cosmetic surgeries of Maryam Nawaz, or maybe, buying cars for different bureaucrats and ministers, or for buying lands for the army and for giving money and in the billions, or trying to, take over lands for the land mafia, or, basically controlling water, controlling petroleum, controlling gas, everything to their advantage. For example, the recent most gas load shedding, that they are deliberately cutting off supply and creating a deliberate shortage of gas, so that one of their ministers, who is in charge of the LNG LPG project, should earn as much money as he can, because the rates of LNG and LPG have doubled as we speak. So this is how they are, you scratch my back and I scratch your back is going on. So again, the IMF does not have the right to talk about what it itself has created. That's the irony here, because the IMF actually describes Pakistan's governance as state capture, where public resources, state contracts, and regulatory frameworks are manipulated by the privileged few. Well, hello to you too. Since you already knew that, why do you keep on giving them loans? Obviously, we have an answer to that, because as I said, the last time actually when this government asked for loans, one of the first things that the IMF pointed out was that this government had a trust deficit as compared to Imran Khan's government, and that this government has a history of taking loans and then creating impossible positions for both the IMF as well as the country. And so the IMF actually refused to give them the loan. But, well, what do you know? The American government literally forced the IMF to give that money. And so once again, Pakistan is stuck with more loans, more debts, staggering under all that interest, So we've got, let's begin a step-by-step breakdown, okay? We've got subsidies and tax breaks. So the elite receive generous subsidies and tax exemptions, contributing to a low tax to GDP ratio, which is around 10%. Then we have sectoral monopolies. Key sectors, which I've spoken about many times, okay? So this has also been identified by the IMF. So key sectors like sugar, real estate, and energy are dominated by politically connected magnates who secure favorable policies, leading to high prices for basic commodities, as noted in the sugar industry's regulatory capture. Again, something that I literally just talked about. And now, banking corruption. Politically connected firms have been found to borrow more while displaying a 50% higher default rate, draining the financial sector. Regulatory capture. The elite ensure that regulatory mechanisms which could otherwise protect the public are either weakened or used to solidify their monopoly, according to analysis by the Lahore University of Management Sciences. The LUMS University, right? So here we are. Now, the IMF dilemma is the worst patient scenario. Pakistan has approached the IMF over 24 times since 1958, leading the fund to consider it their most difficult client. Okay, so this is a vicious cycle that we're looking at. We have the IMF loans like the 37-month, $7 billion program, often which often require austerity measures, right? Increased taxes and reduced subsidies, which are heavily passed on to the public while the elite often avoid their share of the burden. And that contributes to that vicious cycle. And then the elite consistently delay or water down governance reforms demanded by the IMF, such as strengthening the National Accountability Bureau, which is NAB, or increasing tax transparency. This, as we know, is one of the recent most demands of the IMF, where it has literally demanded that the next chief of NAB that is appointed must be transparent, which again confirms the fact that the IMF does not trust the current NAB chief and does not find him transparent, and they have a discrepancy, a whole list of discrepancies probably. Then we have although, as I said, the IMF argues that these measures stabilize the currency, they frequently worsen food and energy inflation in the short term, pushing millions into poverty. So 4 million in the 2022 to 2024 period alone have been pushed into poverty, thanks to the IMF's architecture. Okay? Then 2024 to 2026, let us look at the scarcity of food and money. Okay, this collusion of elite capture and IMF mandated austerity has direct, severe impacts on the economy and population, right? We have food and energy inflation, which peaked with 82% of the population unable to afford a healthy diet. Who would have thought that they are unable to afford a healthy diet, leading to a surge in poverty, which is approximately 40.5% in the fiscal year of 2024, right? So this is a country that exports food, and we're going to come to that. This is a country that is a farm-to-table country. This is an agricultural country, okay? And we are having problems with food. We're having food scarcity. We're having food inflation. Again, this is all deliberate. Understand that this is deliberate because the way everything is designed, if we weren't going through all of this, none of this would be happening. So intense foreign exchange shortages caused by mismanagement, well, not exactly mismanagement, more like corruption, and lack of foreign investment, as we know, especially since this government has come. All those companies that wished to invest withdraw, they literally have withdrawn, and those countries, companies, multinational foreign companies that were already here for years, for decades even, have closed shop, right? So this lack of foreign investment resulted in difficulties importing essential food and fuel. Energy costs, which is right now our biggest example and most recent example of corruption by the government. A 20% rise in electricity tariffs in 2024, coupled with rising fuel costs, disproportionately impacted low-income households. Forget about that. The fact that they have tried their best to literally steal energy from solar producers and force us to pay for their IPPs, which are basically shell companies. Those power production units literally don't even exist. They just exist on paper, or they're just in an empty building that doesn't even produce electricity, but we have to pay for it because somebody or the other in the government is actually involved in that shell company. So there we have it again, going into their pockets. And now the IMF argues that it has designed this because it is thinking that it should make the country stable. But actually, this systematic looting has resulted in an unstable country. It has resulted in a volatile state because now we are in a socio-economic fallout. Okay, institutions, including the judiciary, are perceived as weak, ineffective, or compromised. In other words, they are basically taken over because this is essentially not just a fascist, but a fascist authoritative dictatorship. Okay, and then we have the erosion of public trust, which means that the populace faces high costs of living, low public service quality, which leads to social unrest. Then we have economic stagnation, which is the 6% GDP loss to elite privilege, which hinders long-term growth and creates an economy reliant on consumption and foreign debt rather than production. So the IMF concludes that unless these structural privileges are dismantled, Pakistan's economic stabilization efforts will continue to be sabotaged by vested interest, which again, I will blame neatly back onto the IMF that you were the ones who designed it. You were the ones who designed the whole return. Didn't you think about all of these things? What the IMF has done is basically help with elite capture and it's a design of using the mass, using utilities, using taxes and levies and subsidies, putting all the burden on the public to return the debt, where they could have simply made a condition in such a way where the government will be 100% responsible for returning the debt, and where their money can be traced, the assets can be traced, and it can be traced where that money is actually being used, and then that person or people or parties should be held accountable. And I'm sure there is no law that can stop the IMF from doing that, by the way. So this is where we stand today. We stand here where there is a deliberate water scarcity, okay, because people are refusing to harvest rain, despite the fact that you've seen the amount of rain that our country receives. We are blessed. We are blessed enough. And because we used to, in fact, originally have hydropower units for producing electricity, suddenly they decided, no, we should move to gas and fuel and up the prices, because, hydro is so cheap, And then they decided to, also declare a water scarcity, which we actually do not have, but we are deliberately causing it, definitely. Similarly, now they've come to declaring a gas scarcity, which again, we do not have, because if you look at the OG studies, we literally have at least 100 years worth of gas reserves, and that is amongst the exploited reserves. So imagine about the unexploited reserves that we have. Okay, same as for petroleum, which we have never excavated, never exploited in the first place. So yeah, all these lies that they're producing time and again to cause deliberate shortage, which is again, and it is an affirmation of their corruption, of the level of corruption that we have. And then we come to food colonization, which majorly people tend to blame on the Gulf and Middle Eastern countries, citing African countries, which are supposed to be rich in food and agriculture, but they are also facing the food colonization trap, where they're now having food inflation and scarcity. Pakistan is also one of those countries where the Middle East and Gulf countries have leased lands, where food is now constantly being produced and, exported over to them. And that has caused, because of the way they've designed it, by diverting, for example, water routes, or by using up certain lands for certain crops and harvests, that too has caused to a certain level of water scarcity in all these countries where the Gulf and Middle Eastern countries are growing food for themselves. And not only that, again, as I said, in our country, we have the double devil's trap here, where we don't just have the Gulf and Middle Eastern countries that have leased lands here, that are adding to our water issues or adding to our food inflation issues, but it is our own army, again, our own army that is trying to take over lands from farmers. So they're deliberately causing huge amounts of losses to the farmers so that they should give up their lands, and then the army would swoop in and buy it for scrap. As we know, even in America, more and more people are trying to turn back to farming, and more of those people are now becoming more and more aware of the fact as to how the American government is directly itself involved in sabotaging farmers and farmlands. So this is a global issue again of government corruption, of elite capture. So elite capture is not just in Pakistan, it's just that we feel it even more in Pakistan, obviously, but it is also in America, and it is also in other countries. In some countries it is out and exposed, in some countries it is low-key, where it's not very visible, because maybe you could say the damage done is very gradual, that by the time people will realize it, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Which our case, by the way, in Pakistan is one of those cases where it began gradual. And so people thought, we can survive through it. We can survive through it until we've reached this point where we are beyond salvation, right? So, yeah, this is in short what is going on all over the world, so much for the elites all over the world who belong to that cabal, thinking that, we need to have a one world order. You know what a one world order is? Right now, the whole world is facing almost the exact same kind of weather. Have you noticed? From Canada to Pakistan, the whole world is literally facing almost the exact same kind of weather spell, right? Where you have the cold spell with the hot spell, with the rains, with the hails, with the snow, now that's called one world order. This is me signing out. Khuda Hafiz.